You will understand, of course, that Leo is the more natural fit for the chair. My father did not look at me when he said it. He kept his eyes fixed on the amber liquid in his glass, swirling it so the ice made a sharp, rhythmic clicking sound against the crystal. We were on the 42nd floor of the building my grandfather had built. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the afternoon sun reflected off the Chrysler Tower, creating a jagged streak of white light that cut across the mahogany conference table. The room smelled of lemon polish and the faint, burnt scent of the coffee brewing in the break room down the hall. Leo sat across from me. He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped behind his head. He did not say a word. He did not have to. The smirk on his face told me everything. He had won a race he never even bothered to run. My father set his glass down on the table with a heavy thud. He finally looked at me. His eyes were cold and professional. He spoke as if he were reading a press release. He told me that the board felt a male presence was necessary for the upcoming merger. He told me that my work in the European division had been exemplary, but that the company needed a face that commanded respect in the local market. He meant a face that looked like his. I did not move. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in the hollow of my throat, a hard, rhythmic pulse that felt like it might bruise the skin from the inside. My palms were damp. I pressed them flat against the cool surface of the table to keep my fingers from curling into fists. I felt a drop of sweat slide down my spine. I did not blink. I did not let my breath hitch. I focused on the sound of a distant car horn on Park Avenue, 42 stories below us. It was a faint, lonely sound. The air in the room felt thin. It felt like the oxygen was being sucked out through the vents. My father began to talk about the transition period. He mentioned a title change for me. Senior advisor. It was a hollow name for a role that involved watching my brother dismantle everything I had built over the last decade. Leo shifted in his seat. The leather groaned under his weight. He looked at his watch. He had a lunch reservation at Le Bernardin in 20 minutes. This life-altering moment for me was just a scheduling conflict for him. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my jaw. I realized I was grinding my teeth. I forced myself to relax. I took a slow, shallow breath. I did not scream. I did not throw my glass. I just watched the way the light moved across the table as the sun shifted in the sky. I am Elena. I am 32 years old. For 12 years, I believed that if I stayed later than everyone else, I would be seen. I believed that my father viewed me as a successor rather than a placeholder. I was wrong. My family does not see talent. They see reflections. I am a daughter, which in this room makes me an extra chair at a table where only sons are allowed to eat. They think they have just handed me a polite exit. They think I will take my severance and my meaningless title and fade into the background of some charity board. They are mistaken. This is not the end of the company's story. It is just the moment where I stop writing it for them. Let me pause here for a second. I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were standing in a room full of people who were looking right through you? Have you ever given everything to a person or a place, only to realize you were never actually part of the plan? I am curious to hear your stories about the moments you realized the game was rigged. If you have been there, leave a comment and let me know. If you want to see how this situation turns around, make sure you are following along. I need to know if I am the only one who has felt this specific kind of silence. The silence in that conference room felt different than the silence I grew up with. When I was 7, silence meant safety. It meant my father was busy and my mother was asleep. I remember sitting on the floor of the library in our house in Greenwich. The carpet was a deep navy blue and smelled of wool and dust. I was reading a book on corporate law that I had pulled from the bottom shelf. I didn't understand the words, but I liked the way they looked on the page. They looked like rules. They looked like a map. Leo came in and took the book from my hands. He didn't want to read it. He just didn't want me to have it. He ripped the cover off and threw it into the fireplace. I didn't cry then either. I just watched the paper curl into black ash. I realized then that Leo didn't need to build anything to be powerful. He just had to break what belonged to me. My father walked in a moment later. He saw the book in the fire. He saw Leo standing there. He didn't ask what happened. He just told me to go to my room because I was making the library look messy. That was the first time I understood the hierarchy. That was the day I started watching the way they moved. I spent the next 25 years learning their rhythms. I learned when my father was lying. I learned when Leo was about to fail. I made myself indispensable so that when the time came, the hole I left behind would be too large to fill. I thought that by making myself a pillar, I would become the roof. I didn't realize that they would rather let the whole house collapse than acknowledge that I was the one holding it up. The sun finally slipped behind the neighboring building. The conference room fell into shadow. My father stopped talking. He looked at me as if he expected me to say thank you. I stood up. I straightened my blazer. I felt the cold metal of my wedding ring against my skin. I hadn't spoken to my husband in 3 days because I had been preparing the final reports for the merger. Reports that Leo would now sign his name to. I turned toward the door. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out of the room and toward the elevators. The carpet in the hallway was plush, muffling the sound of my heels. I could hear the faint hum of the city through the exterior walls. It sounded like a machine that never stopped. I pressed the button for the lobby. As the door slid shut, I saw my reflection in the polished metal. I looked calm. I looked controlled. I looked like someone who was leaving a meeting. I didn't look like someone who had just lost everything. That was my first victory of the day. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to prove I was too emotional for the job. I gave them nothing. I stepped out onto the street and felt the cold March air hit my face. It smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. I walked 3 blocks before I stopped. I stood on the corner and watched the people rushing past me. None of them knew what had just happened in that office. None of them cared. I took out my phone. I had one contact saved under a name that wasn't a name. I didn't call. I just looked at the number. I had been holding on to it for 2 years. It was a contingency plan I hoped I would never need. My father thought he was clearing the path for his son. He didn't realize he had just opened the door for his replacement. I walked toward the subway, the vibrations of the passing trains rattling the metal grates under my feet. The air smelled of damp stone and the metallic tang of electricity that always hangs in the tunnels during rush hour. I watched a woman in a red coat struggle with her umbrella, her face twisted in a mask of frustration that I didn't let myself wear. I felt the weight of my laptop bag pulling at my shoulder, a dull ache that reminded me of the hours I'd spent hunched over the merger documents. My body was tired. I was exhausted. I swiped my card and moved through the turnstile, my movements automatic and precise. I found a spot near the doors and stared at my reflection in the dark glass as the train plunged into the tunnel. My face looked pale under the flickering fluorescent lights. I looked like a ghost haunting my own life. I thought about the files sitting on my desk back at the office. They were filled with my notes, my strategies, and the carefully calculated risks that had brought the merger to the finish line. Leo wouldn't even know how to open the encrypted folders without the password I hadn't given him yet. He thinks he can just step into the pilot's seat because he has the right last name. He is wrong. When I reached my apartment in Brooklyn Heights, the hallway was quiet. I could hear the muffled sound of a television from 4B and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the radiator in the corner. I stood at my door for a long moment, my key poised at the lock. I felt a sudden, sharp hesitation. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to see the life I had built with Marcus, a life that felt increasingly like a stage set for a play I no longer wanted to perform in. Marcus is a good man, or at least, he is the kind of man people call good because he never says anything controversial. He works in architectural salvage, spending his days surrounded by things that other people have discarded. Sometimes I feel like I am just another one of his projects. I opened the door. The apartment smelled of roasted garlic and the expensive wood polish Marcus uses on the vintage sideboard. He was in the kitchen, his back to me. He didn't hear me come in. I watched him for a second, the way he hummed to himself as he chopped vegetables. He looked so peaceful. It made me angry. I set my bag down on the floor. The sound made him jump. He turned around, a knife still in his hand, and gave me a soft, tentative smile. He asked me how the meeting went. He asked if we were celebrating. I didn't answer right away. I walked to the window and looked out at the lights of the Manhattan skyline. They looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. I told him that Leo was taking over the merger. I told him that my father had moved me to a senior advisor role. I didn't look at him, but I could hear the way. His breath caught. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say it was unfair. He said that maybe this was a good thing. He said that maybe now I would have more time for us. He said we could finally talk about starting a family. My heart began to pound against my ribs, a fast, frantic drumming that made it hard to hear him. I felt a wave of heat rise up my neck. I realized I was digging my nails into my palms. It was a physical rejection of everything he was saying. He wanted me to be smaller. He wanted me to be a mother so I would stop being a threat. I turned to look at him. His expression was hopeful. It was pathetic, this feeling, this crushing weight of being told to step aside for the sake of balance. It isn't new. I remember when I was 24. I had just finished my first year at the firm. I had discovered a discrepancy in the accounts of one of our biggest clients, a mistake that would have cost us millions in legal fees and ruined our reputation. I stayed up for 3 days straight fixing it. I presented the corrected files to my father in front of the entire executive committee. I expected a promotion. I expected a thank you. Instead, my father patted me on the shoulder and told the room that it was a fine job for a girl. Then he took Leo out for a celebratory steak dinner because Leo had managed to sign a new client that morning, a client I had actually scouted and prepared the pitch for. I sat in my cubicle and ate a cold sandwich from the vending machine. I didn't cry then. I just started a ledger. I started writing down every time I was overlooked, every time my work was credited to someone else, and every time I was told to be patient. That ledger is full now. There is no more room for patience. I looked at Marcus and I felt a sudden, cold clarity. He wasn't on my side. He was on the side of the world that wanted me to stay in the kitchen while the men decided the future. I told him I wasn't hungry. I told him I had work to do. He started to protest, his voice rising in that whining tone he gets when he feels ignored, but I walked past him and into my home office. I shut the door and locked it. The click of the bolt felt like a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The blue light reflected in my eyes. I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger was still there, but it had cooled into something sharp and functional. I am not a senior advisor. I am the architect of this company's success, and if I am not allowed to lead it, then I will be the one to ensure there is nothing left to lead. I want to pause here. I want to know if you've ever had a partner or a friend who tried to use your failure as an opportunity to change you. Have you ever been told that losing your dream was actually a blessing in disguise by someone who just wanted you to be more convenient for them? Tell me about that moment in the comments. I need to know how you handled the realization that you were standing alone. If you want to see what happens when the advisor starts giving the wrong advice, keep listening. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small, leather-bound notebook I always keep with me. I turned to the back, to the page with the phone number I had looked at on the street corner. It belonged to Julian Vane. Julian was my father's greatest rival until he was forced out of the industry by a scandal my father had helped orchestrate. Julian was brilliant, ruthless, and he hated my father with a quiet, burning intensity that matched my own. We had met a year ago at a gallery opening. He had looked at me and said, "You're the one who actually runs that place, aren't you?" It was the first time anyone had seen me clearly. He had given me his number and told me to call him when I was tired of being a shadow. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. I thought about the way Leo had looked at his watch. I thought about my father's cold, professional eyes. I thought about the book burning in the library. I didn't hesitate anymore. I dialed the number. It rang twice before he picked up. He didn't say hello. He just said, "I've been waiting for this call, Elena." His voice was like gravel and silk. It made the hair on my arm stand up. I told him that the merger was happening in 3 weeks. I told him that Leo was the face of it. I told him that I had access to the private servers and the transition logs. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my temple. I was crossing a line I could never uncross. I was committing a betrayal that would erase my name from the family history. I felt a sudden, fleeting thought of my mother. She would be heartbroken. She would think I had lost my way. But then I remembered the way she always looked down at her plate whenever my father dismissed me at dinner. She had chosen silence. I was choosing war. I told Julian I wanted to meet. He gave me an address in the meatpacking district. He told me to come alone. He told me to bring the insurance. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. The room was dark now, except for the glow of the screen. I could hear Marcus moving around in the living room, probably clearing away the dinner he had made for us. He would probably sleep on the couch tonight to show me he was hurt. He didn't understand that his hurt was a luxury I couldn't afford. I began to download the files. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. Each percentage point felt like a brick being removed from the foundation of my father's empire. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. It wasn't regret. It was the feeling of a space being cleared for something new. I knew that by tomorrow morning, my life would be divided into 2 parts, the woman I was supposed to be and the woman I was becoming. I was okay with that. I closed my laptop and stood up. I went to the closet and pulled out a black coat. I checked my reflection one last time. My eyes were bright. My hands were steady. I walked out of the office and through the living room. Marcus didn't look up from the TV. He thought I was going to the kitchen for a glass of water. I didn't stop. I walked out the front door and into the night. The city felt different now. It didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a map. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the pen. The taxis smelled of stale cigarettes and a pungent, citrus-scented air freshener that made the back of my throat itch. I watched the city lights blur into long, neon streaks against the rain-slicked pavement of the West Side Highway as the driver navigated the aggressive late-night traffic with a jagged, impatient rhythm. My heart was a bird in a cage. It beat hard. I looked down at my hands. They were resting on my lap, perfectly still, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins like a cold current. We turned onto Gansford Street. The smooth asphalt gave way to the uneven, jarring bounce of the Belgian blocks, a reminder that this part of the city still held onto its rugged, industrial bones. I paid the driver and stepped out into the wind. The air here was different than in Brooklyn Heights. It was sharper, carrying the scent of the river and the lingering, metallic ghost of the meatpacking plants that used to define these streets. I stood under the rusted canopy of an old warehouse that had been converted into a high-end gallery space. The High Line loomed above me, a dark ribbon of steel and sleeping plants cutting through the sky. I felt small in the shadow of the architecture, but I didn't feel weak. I felt invisible. It is a powerful thing to be the person no one is looking for. I found the entrance Julian had described. It was a heavy, unmarked steel door tucked between a boutique hotel and a closed bistro. I pressed the buzzer. There was no intercom, just the sharp, mechanical click of the lock releasing. I pushed the door open and entered a small, dimly lit lobby with a single elevator. The walls were clad in dark, weathered wood that looked like it had been salvaged from a shipwreck. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse. The ascent was silent. I could feel the pressure changing in my ears. I thought about my father. I thought about the way he had looked at me this afternoon, as if I were a piece of office furniture that had finally outlived its usefulness. He has no idea that I am currently 400 feet in the air, preparing to hand the keys to his kingdom to the man he hates most in the world. The elevator doors slid open. The penthouse was an open-topped expanse of glass and polished concrete. It was minimalist to the point of being hostile. There were no family photos. There were no soft edges. Julian Vane was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out toward the Hudson River. He didn't turn around when I entered. He held a crystal tumbler of something dark and amber, the ice clinking softly as he moved his hand. He was wearing a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than my first car. He looked like power. Not the loud, blustering power of my father, but a quiet, calculating force that felt much more dangerous. I walked toward him, the sound of my heels echoing off the concrete like gunshots. I stopped a few feet away. I didn't wait for him to speak. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the encrypted flash drive. I held it out. My fingers were cold. He turned then. His eyes were the color of slate, and they searched my face with a terrifying intensity. He took the drive from me. His skin was warm. I want to pause here for a moment. Have you ever reached a point where you realized that loyalty was just another word for being a victim? I want to know if you've ever had to betray someone you were supposed to love in order to save yourself. Tell me in the comments if you've ever crossed a line you knew you could never go back across. I need to know if the weight of it ever gets lighter. Julian walked over to a desk made of a single slab of blackened oak. He plugged the drive into a laptop and began to type. The blue light of the screen cast sharp, angular shadows across his face. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't ask if I was afraid. He knew the answer to both. He looked at the first few files, the Kessler account documents. Seeing the name on the screen brought back a memory that felt like a physical blow to my stomach. It was 2018. We were at the Metropolitan Museum for a gala. I had spent 6 months courting the Kessler Group, learning the names of their children, their favorite vintages, their philanthropic goals. I had secured the deal of the decade on a Tuesday morning. At the gala that Friday, my father stood on the stage and announced that Leo had been the one to spearhead the initiative. He said that Leo was the future of the firm. I was standing in the wings, holding my father's coat. I felt the silk lining against my palms. I felt the heat of the stage lights. I didn't say a word. I just watched Leo take the applause for work he hadn't even read. That was the night I realized my father didn't just overlook me. He erased me. He used my labor to build a pedestal for a son who couldn't even find his own office without a map. Julian gave a low, appreciative whistle. He looked up from the screen. He told me that this information was more than just a sabotage tool. He said it was an execution. He explained that if these documents went to the SEC tonight, the merger wouldn't just stall. The firm would be liquidated within the month. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt a sudden, dizzying sense of vertigo. This was bigger than I had planned. I had wanted to hurt my father, to humiliate Leo, but I hadn't realized I was holding the detonator for the entire building. Julian leaned back in his chair. He watched me, waiting for the flicker of hesitation. He wanted to see if I would break. I thought about my office. I thought about the 12 years of my life I had poured into those walls. I thought about the smell of the lemon polish and the way the sun hit the Chrysler Tower. Then I thought about the look on Leo's face when he realized he was the one who had to tell the board the money was gone. I didn't blink. I told Julian to proceed. I told him I wanted the documents leaked at 9 a.m., exactly when the opening bell rang on Wall Street. The room felt incredibly still. I could hear the hum of the laptop fan. I could hear the distant siren of an ambulance somewhere on the West Side Highway. Julian nodded once. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. He pushed it across the desk toward me. He told me that this was my exit strategy. It contained a new identity, a bank account in the Caymans, and a one-way ticket to Zurich. He told me that by the time the dust settled, I needed to be somewhere they couldn't find me. I looked at the envelope. It felt heavy. It felt like a tombstone for Elena. I didn't pick it up yet. I asked him what he got out of this. He smiled then, a slow, thin-lipped expression that didn't reach his eyes. He said he enjoyed watching empires fall, especially when they were built on lies. He said he had been waiting 10 years to see my father lose. I realized then that I was just a weapon in Julian's hand. I was a tool he was using to finish a war he had started a long time ago. I was okay with that. A weapon doesn't have to be the one who hates. It just has to be sharp. I picked up the envelope. The paper was smooth and cool. I felt a strange, hollow sense of relief. The decision was made. The gears were turning. There was no way to stop the machine now. I turned to leave, but Julian caught my arm. His grip was firm, but not aggressive. He told me I was smarter than my father. He told me I was more ruthless than Leo could ever dream of being. Then he let go. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say anything. I walked back to the elevator and pressed the button. As I descended, I watched the floor numbers count down. 10, 9, 8. I felt like I was falling. I felt like I was flying. When the doors opened in the lobby, the air felt colder than before. The rain had turned into a fine, freezing mist that clung to my eyelashes. I walked out onto the cobblestones and didn't look back at the building. I started walking toward the water. I needed to see something that wasn't made of glass and steel. I needed to see something that didn't belong to my father. I reached the pier and leaned against the railing. The Hudson was black and churning, the surface broken by the white crests of small waves. Across the water, the lights of New Jersey twinkled like a low-hanging constellation. I took a deep breath. My lungs felt tight. I thought about Marcus. He was probably still on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, waiting for me to come home and apologize. He didn't know that the woman who lived in that apartment was already gone. He didn't know that he was married to a ghost. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Marcus wanted a life that was quiet and predictable. He wanted a wife who would stay in the lines he had drawn for her. I couldn't be that woman anymore. I couldn't pretend that the house wasn't on fire. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found his name. I deleted it. Then I deleted my father's number. Then Leo's. One by one, I erased the links to my past. The screen felt hot against my thumb. I looked back at the city. The skyscrapers looked like jagged teeth biting into the night sky. Somewhere up there, in a darkened office on the 42nd floor, the ghosts of my family's secrets were about to be dragged into the light. I felt a sudden, frantic urge to laugh. It was a jagged, ugly sound that was swallowed by the wind. I wasn't the daughter they wanted. I wasn't the sister they deserved. I was the consequence. I was the storm they didn't see coming because they were too busy looking at their own reflections. I turned away from the water and started walking. I didn't have a plan for the next hour or the next day. I only knew that for the first time in 32 years, I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. I was the one making the rules. And the first rule was that everyone pays. The subway station was nearly empty. The tiles were stained and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and old trash. I sat on a wooden bench and waited for the train. I looked at the envelope in my lap. I thought about the name inside. Who would I be in Zurich? Would I be happy? I realized I didn't know what happiness felt like. I only knew what winning felt like. Maybe that was the tragedy of being a daughter in a house built by men like my father. You learn how to fight before you learn how to love. You learn how to survive before you learn how to live. I watched the rats scurrying along the tracks, their eyes glinting in the dark. They were survivors, too. They lived in the dark and they took what they needed. They didn't care about legacy. They didn't care about names. They just cared about the next meal. I felt a strange kinship with them. I was going to take what I needed. I was going to survive. The train roared into the station, a wall of hot air and noise that pushed me back against the bench. I stood up. I stepped onto the train. The doors hissed shut behind me. The journey had begun. I was moving. Finally. The train ride back to Brooklyn was a blur of screeching brakes and the rhythmic, metallic clatter of the wheels against the tracks. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the manila envelope Julian had given me. It felt heavy, a physical weight that seemed to anchor me to the seat while the rest of the world rushed by in a smear of dark tunnel walls. I could feel the cold dampness of my coat against my skin. My socks were slightly wet from the rain. I focused on that small, uncomfortable sensation to keep myself from thinking about the timer I had just started. In exactly 9 hours, The world I had spent my entire life trying to conquer would begin to dissolve. It was a strange, hollow thought. I expected to feel a surge of triumph or perhaps a paralyzing wave of fear. Instead, I felt nothing but a profound, clinical exhaustion. My mind was a motherboard that had been overclocked for too long. I needed to shut down. I let my head rest against the cool glass of the window. The vibration of the train traveled through my skull, a jarring hum that matched the buzzing in my ears. I thought about the files Julian was currently scrubbing and prepping for the leak. Every spreadsheet, every memo, every recorded phone call. They were ghosts I had spent years collecting. I remembered the night I found the first discrepancy. It was 3 years ago, during the height of the summer heat wave. The air conditioning in the office had failed, and the air was thick and stagnant. I was working late, as always, digging through the archives for a tax audit. I found a series of offshore transfers that didn't align with the quarterly reports. They were signed by my father, but the beneficiary was a shell company owned by Leo. My heart had hammered against my ribs that night, a frantic, terrified beat. I thought I had found a mistake. I thought I was protecting the family by investigating it. I spent weeks tracing the money, hoping I was wrong. I wasn't. It was a systematic siphoning of funds designed to cover Leo's gambling debts and failed real estate ventures in Macau. When I brought the evidence to my father, he didn't thank me. He didn't look shocked. He just took the folder from my hand, walked over to the shredder, and watched the paper turn into confetti. He told me that loyalty meant knowing when to stop looking. He told me that Leo was the future and that the future needed to be protected at all costs. I was just the girl who checked the math. That was the night the first crack appeared in my foundation. I realized that I wasn't an employee or a partner. I was a janitor. I was there to clean up the messes the men made while they played at being kings. The train slowed as it pulled into my station. The doors hissed open. I stepped out onto the platform and walked toward the stairs. My legs felt heavy, as if I were moving through water. I climbed up to the street and found that the rain had stopped, leaving the city glistening and quiet. The air was scrubbed clean. I walked the 2 blocks to my apartment building, my heels clicking on the sidewalk with a sharp, lonely sound. I reached the front door and hesitated. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to see Marcus. I didn't want to pretend that I was still the woman who lived there. I wanted to keep walking until I reached the edge of the world. But I didn't. I used my key and went inside. The apartment was dark. The only light came from the digital clock on the oven, glowing a soft, neon green. 1:14 a.m. I moved through the living room like a thief. I could hear Marcus's steady, rhythmic breathing coming from the bedroom. He was a deep sleeper. He always had been. He could sleep through storms and sirens and the slow disintegration of his marriage. I stood in the doorway and watched the shadow of his form under the duvet. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that might have been regret, but it was too cold to be sure. He deserved a version of me that didn't exist anymore. He deserved a woman who wanted the life he was offering, the quiet weekends, the children, the slow, comfortable decline into old age. I couldn't give him that. I was a creature made of glass and fire, and I was about to burn down everything he found beautiful. I turned away and went into the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and drank it in one long, desperate gulp. My throat was parched. I sat at the small bistro table by the window and waited for the sun. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the dark and watched the minutes tick by. 2 a.m. 3 a.m. 4 a.m. The city began to wake up. I heard the first garbage truck lumbering down the street. I heard the distant whistle of a tugboat on the river. I felt a strange, detached sense of peace. The decision was no longer mine to make. The wheels were in motion. At 9 a.m., the first emails would hit the desks of the major financial news outlets. At 9:15 a.m., the SEC would receive the encrypted drive. At 10 a.m., the board of directors would be called into an emergency session. By noon, my father's name would be synonymous with the biggest corporate scandal in a generation. And Leo. Leo would finally be the center of attention. He would be the face of the collapse. He would be the one they dragged in front of the cameras to explain why the money was gone. I thought about my mother. She would be awake by now in her house in the Hamptons. She would be having her first cup of tea, looking out at the ocean. She had spent 40 years being the perfect wife to a man who didn't respect her. She had ignored the affairs, the coldness, and the way he spoke to her like she was a slow-witted child. She had done it for us. She had done it to ensure that her children had a legacy. She didn't realize that the legacy was a cage. I wondered if she would ever forgive me. I wondered if she would understand that by destroying the empire, I was finally setting her free too. Or maybe she would just see me as the monster who ruined her life. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I just let it fall. It was the only one I would allow myself. At 6:30 a.m., Marcus walked into the kitchen. He looked startled to see me sitting there in my coat. He asked me if I had been up all night. He looked worried. I told him I had a lot on my mind. I told him I had to go in early for the merger. He walked over and put his hands on my shoulders. His touch was warm. It felt heavy. He told me he was proud of me. He said that after today, things would be different. He said we would take that trip to Italy we had been talking about for years. I looked at him, and I realized I didn't even know who he was. He was a stranger who shared my bed. I told him I had to go. I stood up and picked up my bag. I didn't kiss him. I couldn't. I just walked out the door and didn't look back. The morning air was crisp. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold oxygen fill my lungs. I walked toward the subway, but then I stopped. I didn't want to take the train. I wanted to see the city from above. I hailed a taxi and told the driver to take me to the office. I wanted to be there when it happened. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted to be the first one to witness the fall. As we crossed the Manhattan Bridge, the sun began to rise over the East River, a bright, orange disk that turned the water into liquid gold. The skyscrapers of the financial district looked like giants waking up from a long sleep. They looked solid. They looked permanent. They were an illusion. I want to ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever stood in a place you knew was about to disappear? Have you ever looked at a person you loved and realized you were already saying goodbye, even though they were standing right in front of you? Tell me about the moments you chose yourself over the life you were supposed to live. I need to know if anyone else has felt this specific kind of coldness. Leave a comment below. I'm listening. The taxi dropped me off in front of the building. The lobby was already bustling with assistants and messengers. I walked through the security gate, my movements fluid and practiced. I felt like a ghost moving through a world that didn't know it was dead yet. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor. When the doors opened, the smell of lemon polish hit me like a physical blow. It was the smell of my childhood. It was the smell of my father's ambition. I walked toward my office, but I stopped at the glass doors of the main conference room. My father and Leo were already there. They were standing by the window, talking. Leo was laughing. My father was pointing at something on a chart. They looked happy. They looked like they owned the world. I checked my watch. 8:54 a.m. 6 minutes. I went into my office and closed the door. I didn't turn on the light. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop one last time. I didn't look at the files. I didn't look at the merger documents. I just watched the clock in the bottom corner of the screen. 8:55. 8:56. My heart was a drum. It was so loud I thought they would hear it through the walls. My palms were slick with sweat. I gripped the edges of the desk until my knuckles turned white. 8:57. 8:58. I felt a sudden, frantic urge to run into the conference room and tell them to stop. I wanted to save them. I wanted to be the daughter my father wanted. But then I remembered the way he had looked at me yesterday. I remembered the shredder. I remembered the book burning in the fireplace. The urge passed. 8:59. I closed my eyes and counted the seconds. The silence was broken by the sound of a notification. Then another. Then a chorus of them from the cubicles outside my door. It sounded like a swarm of insects. I opened my eyes. 9 a.m. I stood up and walked to the door. I opened it just enough to see out into the hallway. I saw an assistant stop in her tracks, her eyes wide as she looked at her phone. I saw a junior partner drop his coffee cup. The brown liquid splashed across the white carpet like a bloodstain. The noise level in the office began to rise. It wasn't the sound of work. It was the sound of panic. I looked back toward the conference room. The door was still closed, but I could see the shadows moving behind the frosted glass. They didn't know yet. They were still in the old world. I stepped out into the hallway and started walking toward the elevators. I didn't hurry. I didn't hide. I walked with my head held high, watching the chaos unfold around me. I felt a sudden, sharp burst of electricity. This was it. The end of the beginning. I reached the elevators and pressed the button. I was going down. I was going out. And I was never coming back. The elevator doors opened into the lobby, and for a moment, the world was perfectly still. The marble floor was a vast, polished lake of cream and gray, reflecting the massive crystal chandelier that hung like a frozen explosion from the ceiling. The doorman, a man named Arthur who had tipped his hat to my father for 30 years, smiled at me as I passed. He didn't know. The security guards behind the mahogany desk were checking their monitors, their faces bathed in the flickering blue light of the surveillance feeds. They didn't know either. I walked across the lobby, the sound of my heels muted by the thick wool runners that lined the center of the room. I felt a strange, lightheaded sensation, as if the gravity in the building had suddenly shifted. My chest felt tight, but my hands were steady. I pushed through the heavy brass revolving doors and stepped out into the noise of Midtown. The transition was jarring. The city didn't care that an empire was bleeding out 40 floors above the street. The taxis honked, the tourists jostled, and the steam rose from the manhole covers in thick, white plumes. I walked toward the corner of 48th and Madison, my heart performing a slow, heavy dance against my ribs. I felt a vibration in my pocket. My phone was screaming. I didn't look at it. I knew the area code. I knew the urgency. I stopped at a small, standing-room-only espresso bar a few blocks away. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted beans and the sharp, acidic tang of steamed milk. I ordered a double shot of espresso and stood by the narrow wooden counter, watching the people rush past the window. My phone vibrated again. And again. It was a persistent, rhythmic buzzing that felt like a localized earthquake against my hip. I finally pulled it out. 17 missed calls. 6 from my father. 11 from Leo. I watched as a text message from Leo popped up on the screen. Elena, where the hell are you? The SEC is in the lobby. Answer your phone. I felt a cold, sharp prickle of satisfaction. It was a physical sensation, like a needle being drawn across my skin. I didn't reply. I deleted the message. I looked at my reflection in the chrome espresso machine. I looked remarkably ordinary. I looked like any other woman taking a break from a high-stress job. They always told me I was too invisible to lead. Now, my invisibility was my greatest armor. I want you to think about something for a second. Have you ever been the person who holds everything together, only to be told you're the most replaceable part of the machine? Have you ever watched someone else walk away with the reward for a bridge you spent years building with your own hands? Tell me about the moment you decided to stop being the glue. I want to know what it felt like when you finally let things fall apart. Leave a comment and let me know if you've ever found peace in the middle of a disaster you created. I'm curious if I'm the only one who feels this calm. I remember a winter when I was 19. My father had taken the whole family to a ski resort in Gstaad. It was supposed to be a vacation, but for him, everything was a performance. One afternoon, he decided we would race down a black diamond run. I was a better skier than Leo, faster and more controlled. I reached the bottom first, my lungs burning from the cold air, my face flushed with the thrill of the win. I stood there waiting for my father to congratulate me. When he finally arrived, he didn't even look at me. He waited for Leo, who had tumbled twice and was covered in snow. He clapped Leo on the back and told him he showed real grit by getting back up. He told me that I should have stayed behind him to make sure he was okay. He said a sister's job was to support, not to overshadow. I stood in the freezing wind and realized that in my father's world, my success was just a failure of my character. It was a lesson in humility that I never asked for. I didn't say anything. I just watched the sun set over the mountains. The ice turned purple. The espresso bar's television was mounted high in the corner, usually tuned to a silent loop of financial news. I saw the scroll at the bottom of the screen turn bright red. Breaking news. Major discrepancies found in Kessler-Sterling merger. A photo of our building appeared on the screen, followed by a headshot of my father. He looked regal, untouchable, the way he always did in the press. Underneath his name, the words "under investigation" appeared in bold white letters. The barista paused with a pitcher of milk in his hand, his eyes fixed on the screen. He muttered something about rich bastards and went back to work. He had no idea the person responsible for that headline was standing 3 feet away from him, stirring sugar into a paper cup. I felt a sudden, frantic urge to laugh. I bit my lip until I tasted copper.my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I hesitated. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but I couldn't do it. I answered. Her voice was thin and trembling, a sharp contrast to the composed woman I had seen only a week ago at the opera. She asked me if I had seen the news. She asked me where your father was. She said the house in the Hamptons was already being swarmed by reporters. I felt a hollow ache in my stomach. She was the collateral damage. She was the one who would have to answer the door while the men hid in their offices. I told her I didn't know anything. I told her to turn off the phones and go to the back of the house. I told her I loved her. It was a lie, or at least a partial one. I loved the woman she could have been, not the ghost she had become. I hung up before she could ask me where I was. The guilt was a heavy, wet blanket. I shook it off. I walked out of the espresso bar and headed toward Grand Central. The air was getting colder, the sky turning a bruised shade of gray that promised more rain. I felt like I was moving through a movie set. Everything felt staged. I saw a man in a tailored suit screaming into his phone, his face turning a dark, angry purple. He looked like Leo. I wondered if Leo was currently screaming at a wall, or if he was huddled in a corner trying to figure out which of his friends would still take his calls. Probably neither. He was probably trying to blame the IT department. He was probably trying to blame me. He wouldn't find me. I was already gone. I entered the main concourse of the station. The ceiling was a vast, celestial map of stars and constellations, a reminder of a world that was much older and much larger than the one I had just destroyed. I stood in the center of the room, near the information booth with its 4-faced clock. Thousands of people moved around me, a human tide, flowing in every direction. I felt a profound sense of anonymity. In this room, I wasn't the daughter of a billionaire. I wasn't the senior advisor. I was just a woman with a black coat and a heavy heart. I looked at the clock. 11:15 a.m. In 2 hours, the first warrants would likely be issued. In 4 hours, the bank accounts would be frozen. Julian Vane had done his job well. The information was spreading like a virus, jumping from one news outlet to the next, mutating as it went. The narrative was already being written. The Sterling Empire was being rebranded as a house of cards. I thought about the office one last time. I thought about my desk, the one with a view of the park. I thought about the files I had left in the bottom drawer, the ones that didn't have anything to do with the merger. Personal things. A photo of me and my grandfather. A dried flower from my wedding bouquet. A copy of that book Leo had burned, replaced years later. I realized I didn't want them. They were part of a life that was built on a foundation of rot. Let them be seized. Let the FBI catalog them. They were just objects. I was the only thing that mattered now. I felt a sudden, sharp burst of energy. I wasn't tired anymore. I was electrified. I walked toward the platforms, my pace quickening. I had a ticket to Zurich in my bag, but I wasn't going to the airport yet. There was one more person I needed to see. One more debt that needed to be collected. I exited the station on the 42nd Street side and hailed another taxi. I gave the driver an address in Gramercy Park. It was a quiet, residential neighborhood, a place where the trees were still bare and the iron fences were cold to the touch. The taxi pulled up in front of a brownstone with a polished black door. I paid the driver and stepped out. My legs felt like lead. This was the part one hadn't rehearsed. This was the part that wasn't in the files. I walked up the steps and pressed the bell. I waited. The silence of the street was absolute. I could hear my own breathing, a ragged, uneven sound in the stillness. The door opened. It was Marcus. He looked tired. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, even though it had only been a few hours. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw the man I had married. I saw the person who used to make me laugh before the weight of my family turned me into stone. He didn't ask me what I was doing there. He didn't ask me about the news. He just stepped aside and let me in. The house was cold. He hadn't turned on the heat. We stood in the hallway, the only light coming from the transoms above the door. He asked me if it was true. He asked me if I did it. I didn't lie. I told him everything. I told him about Julian. I told him about the drive. I told him that I was leaving. He didn't scream. He didn't get angry. He just looked at me with a profound, soul-crushing sadness. He said he had always known I was capable of this. He said he had been waiting for the day I finally burned it all down. He asked me if it was worth it. I looked at him, and I realized that he was the only thing I was actually losing. The money, the title, the family, they were already gone. But Marcus was real. I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to tell him to come with me. I wanted to tell him that we could start over. But I knew I couldn't. I was too broken for him now. I was a weapon that had already been fired. I turned around and walked back out the door. I didn't look back. I didn't say goodbye. The air outside was freezing. I started to run. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. The rain was a solid curtain of gray by the time I reached the pier. It hammered against the roof of the taxi like 1,000 small, frantic fists. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, and the wind immediately caught the hem of my coat, whipping it against my legs. The doorman offered an umbrella, but I shook my head. I wanted the cold. I wanted the sting of the water on my face to remind me that I was still standing. The lobby was a sanctuary of white marble and hushed, expensive silence, but the air felt heavy with the scent of lilies and damp wool. I didn't stop at the desk. I walked straight to the private elevators. The operator started to ask for my floor, then saw my face and looked away. He knew who I was. He had probably seen my family's name scrolling across the bottom of every news channel for the last 3 hours. The elevator rose with a sickening smoothness. I watched the numbers climb. 48, 49, 50. My stomach did a slow, painful roll. I wasn't afraid. I was hollow. The doors opened directly into my father's suite. The room was a battlefield. Legal pads were scattered across the mahogany coffee table, and the air was thick with the acrid, blue haze of cigar smoke, a smell I hadn't encountered since my grandfather's funeral. My father was standing by the window, his back to the room. He looked smaller. Then I remembered. Leo was pacing the length of the Persian rug, his tie loosened, his hair a mess of sweaty spikes. He was screaming into a burner phone. He looked like a cornered animal, panicked and dangerous. There were 3 lawyers in the corner, speaking in low, urgent tones. They stopped when they saw me. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, dripping water onto the pristine wood floor. Leo stopped mid-stride. He dropped the phone onto a chair. He looked at me with a mixture of hope and pure, unadulterated rage. He asked me where I had been. He said they had been calling for hours. He told me the servers had been wiped, that the transition logs were gone, and that the SEC had files they shouldn't even know existed. He asked if I had a backup. He asked if I could fix it. I looked at him, and I felt a sudden, sharp memory of when I was 16. I had found a $3 million loophole in a commercial lease for one of our shopping centers. I had spent my entire spring break drafting a correction. When I presented it to my father, he didn't even read it. He handed me a crystal vase of white lilies and told me to go help the maid arrange them for the dinner party. He told me that the smell of lilies was more important for a woman to understand than the smell of ink. I remember the weight of that vase. It was heavy and cold. I remember thinking that if I dropped it, it would shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces that no one could ever put back together. I didn't drop it then. I carried it to the dining room, and I made sure every petal was perfect. I smiled for the guests. I played the part. But standing in this room now, watching Leo fall apart, I realized I had been holding that vase for 16 years. And I was finally ready to let go. I walked toward the center of the room. My father turned around. His face was a mask of calculated composure, but I could see the tremor in his hands. He looked at me with those cold, blue eyes, the eyes that had always looked through me. He told me that the family was under attack. He said that a competitor had somehow breached our security. He asked me to go to the office and start the recovery protocols. He spoke as if I were still his senior advisor. He spoke as if I were still the girl who arranged the flowers. I didn't move. I felt my heart thudding in the hollow of my throat, a hard, rhythmic pulse. I told him no. The word was small, but it felt like a mountain. The room went still. Leo laughed, a short, jagged sound that lacked any humor. He asked me what the hell I meant by no. He said this wasn't the time for a tantrum. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him I wasn't having a tantrum. I told him I was the competitor. I told him I was the breach. I watched the realization move across his face like a slow-motion car crash. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. My father didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at me, his expression shifting from confusion to a cold, dark understanding. He asked me why. He asked how I could betray the blood that gave me everything. That I felt a sudden, frantic urge to scream, but I kept my voice steady. I told him that blood didn't give me everything. I told him I earned everything I had, and he spent his entire life trying to give it to a son who didn't even know how to read a balance sheet. I told him that I wasn't the daughter who betrayed him. I was the architect who finally decided to stop building his monuments. I felt a drop of cold rainwater slide down my neck. I didn't shiver. I stood my ground. Leo took a step toward me, his face turning a dark, angry purple. He called me a traitor. He called me a bitch. I didn't flinch. I told him that by tomorrow, he wouldn't even be a name in a headline. He would just be a footnote in a bankruptcy filing. My father walked toward me then. He stopped a few inches away. He smelled of old tobacco and expensive cologne. He told me that I had destroyed the family legacy. He said that my grandfather would be ashamed of me. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the man who built the first tower with his own hands while his wife sold her jewelry to pay the workers. He wouldn't have been ashamed. He would have been the only one in this room who understood that power isn't given, it's taken. I told my father that the legacy was already dead. I told him he killed it the day he chose a shadow over the sun. I turned to leave. I had seen enough. I had heard enough. I didn't need their apologies or their understanding. I just needed the exit. Leo grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into my skin. He told me I wasn't going anywhere. He said the lawyers would have me in handcuffs by the end of the week. I looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. I told him that if he didn't let go of me in the next 3 seconds, I would release the recordings I have of him talking to the Macau investors. I told him. I had the transcripts of the calls he made from the company line to his bookie. I counted to 1. He let go. His hand dropped to his side as if it had been burned. I walked back to the elevator. I didn't look back. I could hear them starting to argue again, their voices rising in a frantic, ugly chorus of blame. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of my old life. The descent was faster this time. I felt the pressure in my ears pop. I felt light. I felt dangerous. When the doors opened in the lobby, the doorman was still there. He tipped his hat to me again. I walked past him and out into the rain. I want to stop here for a moment. Have you ever stood in the middle of a burning bridge and realized you were the one who lit the match? Have you ever looked at the people who were supposed to protect you and realized they were the ones you needed protection from? Tell me about the moment you stopped being the victim and started being the storm. I want to know how it felt to finally say the things you've been whispering to yourself for years. Leave a comment and tell me your story. I need to know if the fire ever stops feeling this good. The city felt different now. The lights of the taxis were no longer streaks of neon. They were beacons. I walked toward the river. I didn't have an umbrella, and my clothes were soaked through, but I didn't care. I felt like the rain was washing away the scent of lemon polish and burnt coffee. It was washing away the senior advisor and the placeholder. I walked until I reached the promenade overlooking the water. The Hudson was a dark, churning mass, the waves hitting the pier with a heavy, rhythmic thud. I leaned against the railing and looked out at the skyline. The buildings looked like teeth. They looked like a graveyard. I took my phone out of my pocket. It was still vibrating. I had 38 missed calls now. I looked at the screen and I saw a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was just an address and a time. Midnight. The Meatpacking District. Julian Vane. I knew what it was. It was the final step. It was the insurance drop. I had handed over the corporate files, but I still had the personal ones. The ones that didn't just ruin the company, the ones that would ruin the men. I thought about the files. I thought about the years I spent collecting them, piece by piece, like a mosaic of failure. I thought about my mother. I thought about Marcus. I realized I didn't want to go to Zurich yet. I wasn't finished. I wasn't just going to leave. I was going to watch the end. I started walking again. My feet were sore, but my mind was sharp. I felt a sudden, sharp burst of cold wind that nearly knocked me over. I laughed. It was a jagged, honest sound. I was 32 years old, and I was finally awake. I walked toward the subway, my heels clicking on the wet pavement with a new, aggressive rhythm. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the person everyone was looking for. And they were never going to find me. Not until I wanted them to. I stepped onto the train and watched the doors close. I was moving. I was free. I was the consequence. And the consequence was just getting started. The train was nearly empty. I sat in the corner and watched the dark tunnel walls fly past. I thought about the library in Greenwich. I thought about the book burning in the fireplace. I thought about the girl who sat on the floor and watched her world turn to ash. She's not here anymore. She's gone. There's only me. And I'm the one with the fire now. I reached into my bag and touched the manila envelope. It was still there. It was dry. I felt a sense of profound, quiet power. The game was over. I had won. But I realized that winning didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a clean slate. It felt like the first breath of air after being underwater for a decade. I closed my eyes and let the motion of the train carry me toward the midnight meeting. I was ready. I was finally ready. The Meatpacking District at midnight feels like a stage where the actors have all gone home, leaving only the ghosts of the industrial past to wander the cobblestones. The rain had slowed to a persistent, freezing drizzle that coated everything in a layer of black glass. I stepped out of the taxi and felt the wind whip through the narrow gaps between the warehouses, carrying the scent of salt from the Hudson and the faint, sweet smell of rotting fruit from a discarded crate near the gutter. My boots made a sharp, rhythmic clicking sound on the stones. It was the only sound in the street. I could feel the cold dampness of my hair clinging to my neck, but I didn't pull up my hood. I wanted to feel the bite of the air. It kept me sharp. It kept me from drifting into the numbness that had been threatening to swallow me since I left Marcus. My heart was a steady, heavy thud against my ribs. I felt a slight tremor in my left hand, so I tucked it deep into my coat pocket. I wasn't afraid. I was simply vibrating at a frequency the rest of the world couldn't hear. I found Julian exactly where he said he would be. He was sitting in the back of a black SUV parked under the rusted overhang of an old meat lockers building. The engine was idling, a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The windows were tinted dark enough to look like voids. As I approached, the rear door clicked open. I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside and the door shut behind me, sealing out the sound of the wind. The interior smelled of expensive leather and a hint of sandalwood. Julian was sitting in the far corner, the glow from his tablet illuminating the sharp planes of his face. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't just calculation. It was respect. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. I reached into my bag and pulled out the second drive, the one with the personal files. These weren't just business records. These were the things that happened in the dark. The offshore accounts tied to Leo's gambling. The hush money payments my father had authorized to bury a sexual harassment suit 3 years ago. The evidence that they hadn't just been greedy, they had been cruel. I watched Julian plug the drive into his tablet. His fingers moved with a practiced, predatory grace. I thought about a board meeting from 2 years ago. We were discussing the acquisition of a smaller logistics firm. I had spent months preparing the valuation, identifying a $400 million tax liability that would have sunk us if we proceeded. When I tried to present my findings, Leo interrupted me after the first slide. He told the board that I was being characteristically cautious and that we needed bold leadership, not administrative anxiety. My father had nodded in agreement. He didn't even look at my report. He told me to go fetch the catering staff because the coffee was getting cold. I remember standing by the mahogany sideboard, pouring hot liquid into porcelain cups while they voted to throw away $400 million just to satisfy Leo's ego. I felt the heat of the steam on my face. I felt the weight of the silver tray in my hands. I realized then that they didn't just want my labor. They wanted my silence as a tribute to their greatness. I didn't say a word. I just served the coffee. Now, as Julian's screen filled with the red and white icons of the files I had stolen, I felt a sudden, sharp burst of electricity in my spine. The coffee was finally cold. Julian looked up from the screen. He told me that this was the final nail. He said that by tomorrow morning, the board would have no choice but to trigger the morality clauses in their contracts. My father would be stripped of his chairmanship. Leo would be barred from the industry for life. They wouldn't just be broke, they would be pariahs. I leaned back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. It wasn't regret. It was the feeling of a space being cleared. The structure of my entire life, the striving, the protecting, the hiding was gone. I was standing in the ruins of the temple, and I was the only one who knew how to find the exit. Julian asked me if I was ready for the next part. He said the media would be looking for a whistleblower. He said I could be the hero of the story if I wanted to be. I opened my eyes and looked at him. I told him I didn't want to be a hero. I told him I just wanted to be gone. I want to pause here for a second. Have you ever been in a position where you had the power to destroy someone who had spent years trying to break you? Have you ever had the chance to finally speak the truth, only to realize that the truth was so ugly you didn't even want to own it anymore? Tell me in the comments if you've ever chosen silence as your final weapon. I want to know if anyone else has felt this specific kind of exhaustion. I'm curious if the victory ever feels as good as the planning. Julian nodded. He reached into the glove compartment and handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope. He told me that my accounts were active. He said the jet was waiting at Teterboro. He told me I had 24 hours before the SEC would want a formal statement, and by then, I could be anywhere in the world. I took the envelope. It felt light. It felt like a wing. I thanked him and opened the door. The cold air hit me like a physical blow, shocking the warmth from my skin. I stepped out onto the cobblestones and watched the SUV pull away. Its taillights were two red eyes that disappeared into the mist. I was alone. Truly alone. I started walking toward the river. I needed to see the water one last time before I left. I found myself standing on the edge of the pier, looking out at the dark, churning expanse of the Hudson. Across the water, the lights of the city were reflected in long, shimmering needles of gold and white. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a news alert. Sterling Global CEO arrested at the pier. There was a grainy photo of my father being led to a police car, his coat draped over his handcuffed hands. He looked old. He looked confused. Behind him, Leo was screaming at a reporter, his face contorted in a mask of ugly, impotent rage. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that felt like grief, but I knew it wasn't for them. It was for the girl who had spent 30 years waiting for a man who didn't exist to love her. I took the phone and held it over the water. I didn't hesitate. I let go. I watched it fall, a small, glowing rectangle that vanished into the blackness with a quiet splash. The silence that followed was absolute. I took a deep breath, the freezing air burning my throat. I felt a sudden, frantic urge to run. I wanted to move faster than the news. I wanted to outrun the shadow of my name. I walked back toward the street and hailed a taxi. I gave the driver the address for the private terminal. As we drove through the city, I watched the people on the sidewalks. They were living their lives, unaware that the skyline had just changed. They were going to dinner, walking their dogs, arguing about things that didn't matter. I felt a profound sense of envy. I wanted to be one of them. I wanted a life that was quiet and small. But I knew I couldn't have that. Not yet. I had one more thing to do. I reached the terminal at 2 a.m. The building was a sleek, glass and steel structure that felt more like a gallery than an airport. A man in a dark suit met me at the door. He didn't ask for my ID. He just took my bag and led me toward the tarmac. The jet was a white needle pointing toward the sky, its engines already whining with a low, impatient power. I climbed the stairs and stepped into the cabin. It was filled with the scent of fresh lilies. I stopped in my tracks. My heart began to pound, a fast, panicked rhythm. I looked at the table in the center of the room. There was a large crystal vase filled with white lilies, exactly like the ones in the pier. Next to it was a handwritten note. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. It was from my mother. It just said, "Go. Don't look back. I'll be right behind you." I sat down in the plush leather chair and fastened my seatbelt. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I just let it fall. My mother had known. She had always known. She had been the one who taught me how to be invisible, and in doing so, she had taught me how to survive. I looked out the window as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. The lights of New York were a glittering carpet that stretched to the horizon. I thought about Marcus, sleeping in our quiet apartment, dreaming of a life we would never have. I thought about my father, sitting in a holding cell, wondering where he went wrong. I thought about Leo, realizing for the first time that his name didn't mean anything without me. I felt a sudden, sharp burst of gravity as the plane lifted off the ground. The city fell away. The buildings became toys. The lights became dust. I was in the air. I was in the dark. I was finally free. The world was ending. I ordered a drink. I watched the clouds swallow the last of the coastline. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the steady, comforting hum of the engines. I leaned my head against the window and closed my eyes. I thought about the library in Greenwich. I thought about the book burning in the fireplace. I realized that the fire hadn't just destroyed the book, it had forged the person I was today. I wasn't the victim of my family's story. I was the author of its final chapter. I felt a sense of peace that was so profound it felt like sleep. I wasn't Elena Sterling anymore. I was someone new. Someone I hadn't met yet. I was ready to find out who she was. As the sun began to rise over the Atlantic, casting a long, golden streak across the clouds, I felt the weight of the last 12 years lift off my shoulders. It was a physical sensation, like a heavy coat being removed in a warm room. I looked at the vase of lilies. I reached out and touched one of the petals. It was soft. It was real. It didn't smell like ink or burnt coffee. It just smelled like the morning. I smiled. It was the first honest thing I had done in years. I closed my eyes and let the light wash over me. I was moving toward a horizon I couldn't see, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what was waiting there. I was the storm. And the storm was over. I want to ask you one last thing. When the dust finally settles and the people who hurt you are gone, what do you do with the silence? Do you fill it with something new, or do you just let it sit there until it feels like home? Tell me how you find yourself again after you've spent your whole life being someone else. I'm listening. I've got all the time in the world now. The jet leveled out at 30,000 feet. The sky was a perfect, endless blue. I was exactly where I needed to be. Nowhere. And everywhere. The journey was just beginning. I could feel it in the way the air moved in the cabin. I could feel it in the steady beat of my own heart. I was no longer a shadow. I was the light that cast it. I took a sip of my drink and looked out at the infinite blue. I had won. But more importantly, I had escaped. And in this world, that's the only victory that matters. The cabin door opened and the flight attendant asked if I needed anything else. I looked at her and I realized I didn't even know her name. I told her no. I told her I had everything I needed. She smiled and closed the door. I was alone with my thoughts and my lilies. I felt a sudden, sharp burst of joy. It was so intense it made my breath hitch. I was 32 years old and my life was finally mine. I wasn't a daughter or a wife or an advisor. I was just me. And that was more than enough. I leaned back and watched the sun climb higher in the sky. The future was a blank page. And I was the one holding the pen. I thought about the ledger I had kept for all those years. I realized I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need to keep track of the debts and the insults. The account was settled. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small, leather-bound notebook. I tore out the pages one by one and let them fall to the floor. They looked like white birds in the dim light of the cabin. By the time I was finished, the notebook was empty. Just like me. I felt a sense of lightness that was almost dizzying. I was ready. I was finally, truly ready. The plane banked slightly to the left, heading toward the heart of Europe. I looked out the window and saw the first hint of land. It was jagged and green and beautiful. It was a new world. And it was waiting for me. I took a deep breath and felt the air fill my lungs. It was cold and clean and tasted of nothing but the future. I was Elena. And I was just getting started. The final task was ahead of me. Not a task of destruction, but one of creation. I had to build a life from the ashes. I had to learn how to exist without a war to fight. It would be the hardest thing I'd ever done. But as I watched the clouds drift past, I knew I was up for it. I was a Sterling, after all. And if there was one thing we knew how to do, it was build, but this time, I was building for me. Only for me. The sun was fully up now, a bright, blinding light that filled the cabin. I didn't turn away. I looked right into it. I wasn't afraid of the light anymore. I was part of it. I felt the plane begin its long, slow descent toward Zurich. I felt the change in pressure. I felt the ground coming up to meet me. I was landing. I was home. Even if I'd never been there before. I stood up and smoothed my coat. I checked my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, but I looked alive. My eyes were bright. My hands were steady. I walked toward the door. I was ready to step out into the world. I was ready to be seen. The doors opened and the air of Zurich hit me. It was crisp and smelled of snow and chocolate and old money. It felt like a fresh start. I stepped out onto the stairs and took my first step into my new life. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. I was free. The end of the story was just the beginning of mine. And it was beautiful. I walked across the tarmac, my heels clicking on the pavement with a sharp, confident rhythm. I wasn't running anymore. I was arriving. And I was exactly on time. The world was waiting. And I was ready to meet it on my own terms, finally. The hotel suite in Zurich overlooked the Limmat River. I watched the water move under the stone bridges, a steady, unhurried flow that didn't care about the names on the bank accounts or the scandals in the morning papers. The room was filled with the scent of beeswax and the faint, herbal fragrance of the tea cooling on the table beside me. It was a clean, clinical kind of luxury. There were no ghosts here. No shadows of my father's expectations or the echo of Leo's entitled laughter. I sat by the window and watched a tram rattle past on the street below, its bell ringing with a sharp, clear tone that cut through the morning mist. My hands were perfectly still. I looked at my reflection in the glass and saw a woman I finally recognized. She wasn't an advisor. She wasn't a placeholder. She was the only person left standing in a room full of collapsed giants. The silence was expensive. It was the kind of silence you have to buy with a decade of your life and the systematic destruction of everyone who ever told you that you were small. I opened the laptop one last time. The headlines had shifted from the arrest to the details of the liquidation. The Sterling Global brand was being carved up by creditors like a carcass in a butcher shop. I saw a photo of our office on Park Avenue with a for lease sign being placed in the window. That office was the only world I had known for 12 years. I remembered a Tuesday in October when I was 28. I had been suffering from a fever, my skin hot and clammy, my head spinning with every movement. I had stayed until 3 in the morning to finish a pitch for a pharmaceutical merger that my father had promised to let me lead. When I arrived the next morning, shaking and exhausted, I found Leo sitting in my chair. My father told me that I looked unwell and that it was better for the client to see a strong, healthy face like Leo's. He told me to go home and rest, as if he were doing me a favor. I walked out of the building into the freezing rain, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack a bone. I realized then that my health, my time, and my talent were just resources for them to exploit until they were no longer convenient. I didn't go home. I went to a cafe, opened my laptop, and began the first folder of the ledger that would eventually destroy them. It took 4 years. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my chest as I thought about Marcus. I wondered if he had gone back to the apartment to pack his things, or if he was still sitting on that couch, waiting for a version of me that was never coming back. I imagined the smell of the wood polish in our hallway and the way the light used to hit the kitchen table on Sunday mornings. It felt like a memory of a movie I had watched a long time ago. It was beautiful, but it wasn't mine. I had traded the comfort of a lie for the cold reality of the truth. I looked at the cream-colored envelope from my mother. I hadn't opened the second letter yet. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my temple. My palms were damp. I reached out and broke the wax seal. Inside was a single key to a safety deposit box in Geneva and a small, faded photograph of me as a baby, held by a woman who looked nothing like the ghost I had left behind in the Hamptons. She was smiling. She looked powerful. On the back, she had written, "You were always the storm. I am the storm." I closed the envelope and tucked it into my bag. I didn't need the money in the safety deposit box, but I would take it anyway. It was the only inheritance that mattered because it was given in secret, woman to woman, survivor to survivor. I stood up and walked to the mirror. I straightened the collar of my coat. I looked at the way the light from the window caught the gray in my hair, a few silver strands I hadn't noticed before. They felt like metals. I thought about my father sitting in that cell, his polished shoes scuffing against the concrete floor. I thought about Leo trying to explain to a public defender why he deserved a private jet. They were learning what it felt like to be invisible. They were learning the weight of a silence they didn't create. I felt a sudden, jagged burst of laughter bubble up in my throat. I didn't suppress it. It was a loud, honest sound that filled the empty suite. I wasn't a shadow anymore. I was the one who cast it. I want to ask you something, now that we've reached the end of this. When you look at the people who have tried to keep you in the dark, do you see enemies, or do you see the fuel for your own fire? Have you ever realized that the very things they used to dismiss you are the things that made you dangerous? Tell me in the comments how you plan to spend your freedom once you finally stop waiting for their permission. I'm curious to know if you've realized that the cage was never locked. You just had to be willing to burn the house down to get to the door. I'm moving on now. I have a train to catch. The lobby of the hotel was quiet as I checked out. The clerk didn't ask for my name. He just took the key and wished me a pleasant journey. I walked out onto the street and felt the cold, crisp air of the Alps hit my lungs. It tasted like iron and snow. I started walking toward the station, my boots clicking on the pavement with a sharp, final rhythm. I didn't look back at the hotel. I didn't look back at the river. I looked at the horizon, where the mountains met the sky in a jagged, white line. I was 32 years old, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a ledger. I didn't have a name that belonged to anyone else. I was just a woman walking toward a train, and that was the most powerful thing I had ever been. The world was wide and cold and perfectly, beautifully empty. I stepped onto the platform and waited for the whistle. I was ready. I was finally, truly home. The train pulled into the station with a heavy, metallic groan. I stepped inside and found a seat by the window. As the carriage began to move, I watched the city of Zurich slip away, replaced by the green slopes and the dark pine forests of the countryside. I leaned my head against the glass. The vibration of the wheels was a steady, comforting pulse. I felt the tension leave my jaw. I felt my heartbeat slow to a calm, regular rhythm. I was free. I was anonymous. I was the architect of my own beginning. The story of the Sterlings was over. My story was just starting. I closed my eyes and let the light of the sun warm my face. I was moving. Finally. Everything was exactly as it should be. The fire was out. The air was clear. I was alone, and I was enough.